We got a good show today. We're going to cover off inflation, what it is, what we need to do about it, why it's a worry, why it's a problem, what causes it. And we've got none other than Dr. Don Brash, who was the famous, infamous, important, amazing, depending on your point of view, Reserve Bank governor that operated under the Reserve Bank Act, the new Reserve Bank Act, that brought inflation under control when it really was out of control. And then we're going to be talking free speech with the Free Speech Union, what it is, why it's important, similar to the one of inflation. It's lovely to have you along, and I'm going to enjoy the show with you. For my part, I have had the kids home for 2 weeks, and living as we do in Arrowtown, I've never had skis on my feet in my life, but I've been driving up and taking the kids skiing, and I've got to say, people have a lot of fun skiing. I wish I'd discovered that when I was young, because you see these young kids, little wee toddlers can hardly stand up, and off they go on a pair of skis whizzing down the mountain. It's a fabulous thing to witness. But let's start right in with, well, I guess it's the economic issue of the day, inflation. And we've got with us, I think no one better to talk about it than Dr. Don Brash. Good afternoon, Don.
Good afternoon, Rodney. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on to our show, and thank you for sharing us your experience and your knowledge. And I imagine as an ex-governor of the Reserve Bank, you have to be a little bit careful what you say. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Even when you're an ex-governor.
And why is that? Is that because, you could send a signal through the markets, or you don't want to speak?
No, I think the problem is that the current governor has all the information at his fingertips.
Yes.
By definition, I don't. So while I've got some quite strong views on how things are going at the moment, I'm aware of the fact that he has more information than I do. So I'm just a little cautious.
Okay, so it's more out of it's because you know what you don't know, whereas someone like me's just got an opinion. You know what you don't know, and so you're conscious of what you don't know. It's the old story about when you know a lot about something, you realise you know nothing at all.
That's roughly correct, yeah.
Now, we've got a bit of time, Don, and I'd like to share with us, first of all, how does one become the Reserve Bank governor?
Well, the governor is appointed by the Minister of Finance, but he has to appoint someone who has been recommended to him by the directors of the Reserve Bank. Now, okay, he appoints the directors of the Reserve Bank, so one way or the other, the Minister of Finance carries the main responsibility. But typically, directors of the Reserve Bank are appointed over a period of time, some appointed by the current government, some appointed by the previous government. So it's not a totally political process.
And
that's the theory.
And what skills are they looking for in appointing a Reserve Bank governor?
Well, I would have thought they would want two skills in particular. One, intimate knowledge of economics and particularly monetary policy. And the current government clearly has that. He was my chief economist for a time when I was governor. And, of course, they want someone who will communicate. And I think it's important that the governor does spend a lot of his time getting out, talking to people, explaining to farmers, Rotary clubs, etc., what he's on about. Because at the end of the day, inflation is to some extent affected by people's expectations of future inflation.
Now, tell me about your background before you became Reserve Bank governor. What led you into being considered for that job?
Well, I had a variety of careers before I was appointed governor in 1988. I guess I was chief executive of an investment bank in the 70s. I was chief executive of the Kiwi Fruit Authority, which I mentioned because it was an exporter, and clearly the Reserve Bank has a big effect on exporters through its effect on the exchange rate. Then, of course, I was chief executive of Trust Bank, a retail savings bank, and then, of course, appointed to the Reserve Bank. So my background was in economics. I had a PhD in economics from the Australian National University. So economics background. But I think one of the reasons I was appointed was they were looking for someone who would actually get out there and talk a lot. And they thought I could do that because, as I say, previously before the 1989 Act was passed, the Reserve Bank was a kind of a secret temple, if you like. Not much was known about it. They kept under the radar. They basically did as the elected government told them to do day to day, and that was a disastrous policy because politicians tend to manipulate monetary policy to their own political advantage. The 1989 Reserve Bank Act, which was put in place not long after I became governor, changed that and indeed created a structure which was unique in the world. Prior to that 89 Act, central banks around the world were of two kinds. They were either completely independent of politics, at least in theory, Federal Reserve Board in the United States, European Central Bank in Europe, etc., Swiss National Bank, or they were totally beholden to the politicians of the day. And they did as the politicians of the day told them to do. Now, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act was unique.
So just interrupting there, Don, before the 1989 Act, the Governor of the Reserve Bank was basically in secret under the sway of the government.
That's correct.
So the government would tell the Reserve Bank governor, what, in a phone call or a letter or a telegram in those days? I mean, how did that get communicated?
I'm not too sure because by the time I became governor, the Minister of Finance, Rodney Hide Don Brash, had already said to the Reserve Bank, I do not want to get involved in the detail of how you reduce inflation.
Okay.
I just want you to get it down. So it was a new framework. But the thing which was good about that framework was that the rate of inflation really ought to be a political decision. How fast do you want your currency to devalue? It's a political decision, not a bureaucrat decision. But once the politicians have decided what the inflation rate should be and have announced that in writing to the public, then the bureaucrats in the Reserve Bank are charged with delivering that. And I think it's a very good framework.
It was an excellent framework, and I hadn't appreciated that you were appointed to the job before the 89 Act was actually passed.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Now, the other thing that listeners will be interested to know, and of course this was a peculiarity of the time when the government of the day, dealing really with an economic crisis from 84 onwards, sought out the best people. You had stood for the National Party for Parliament, and yet you were appointed by a Labour government to the job.
Yeah, that's right. And I look back on my standing for the National Party in 1981. At the time, I was devastated, but I look back to think, thank heavens I was defeated, because the next 3 years I'd been watching Rob Muldoon do all the things I strongly disagreed with, and then watching from opposition, watching Rodney Douglas do what I agreed with. And I mean, Rodney Douglas just took monetary policy for a second, really reformed that framework, and it's been copied internationally.
Yes.
Australia's copied it, Canada's copied it, UK, Sweden, you name it.
It's one of the amazing things about New Zealand. We often say, we're leading the world, oftentimes when we're not. Or we say we're leading the world and no one follows us, such as with ACC. We say, we led the world with this, but no one follows us. But when we did the Reserve Bank Act, around the world, monetary theorists looked upon New Zealand in wonder that the politicians had done this, and then many jurisdictions copied it. That's
right. Now, virtually every central bank, at least in a developed country, has an inflation target. We were the first one to have a specific public inflation target, initially 0 to 2, now, of course, 1 to 3. But virtually every developed country central bank has now an inflation target. Now, not every country followed the constitutional change whereby that inflation target is mandated by the elected government. And I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, it is the bureaucrat decision how fast you want your money to depreciate in value. It's a political judgment. But governments must make that explicit in writing so they know what the government is intending. And as I say, in our case, of course, is keep the inflation rate between 1% and 3%.
Now, the interesting thing about this is, and I noticed you used the phrase, was it depreciate your currency? Is it depreciate your
money?
Your money. So inflation is a depreciation in the value of the New Zealand dollar.
Right. absolutely.
So your dollar doesn't go as far today as it went yesterday, and it won't go as far tomorrow.
Right, that's right.
Okay, so that target is in New Zealand and then around the world is set by the politicians elected to power and given across to Reserve Bank governor to implement, the assumption being that it's within the control of the Reserve Bank to achieve that rate.
Yep, that's right. And that rests on the assumption that, as Milton Friedman said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, other factors bear on the inflation rate, but finally, you can't have sustained inflation unless the money supply is growing.
And that's the trick, isn't it? It's this idea of sustained inflation, because you can imagine that you get a spike in oil prices, and that spikes up the relative price of everything, but that's not in of itself inflation. It might show up as inflation, but it's not sustained. It goes through once and then it stays there, correct?
Yep, that's right. Exactly.
And so, and as I understand it, the Reserve Bank has the power to look through those one-off shocks.
Yeah, I mean, has the power and in fact has a political understanding that the Reserve Bank should not crunch the domestic economy because there's a war in Ukraine,
yes,
which pushes up the oil price. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing. You could say to the central bank, look, we want you to suppress all inflation, in which case you'd run monetary policy much tighter, and try and offset the rise in oil prices with falls in other prices. But the general view is, and I share it, that doesn't make much sense.
No, because you'd be yanking us around. You'd be yanking it around a lot, up and down. Now,
certainly would.
Because this seems to me to be, I'm staggered by this because we'll get to this. But when you came to office as Reserve Bank governor, politicians had spent a generation or two explaining that inflation was nothing to do with them, or it was all about, greedy employers or greedy unions or overseas events. And with the introduction of the Reserve Bank Act and then your communication, we slowly gained an understanding that actually it was a result of monetary policy. And that was firmly understood. It seemed to me by people who were reading the newspaper and listening, and indeed, I would suggest watching what happened. And we'll get to this because you brought inflation under control. Now, we're back into this world now, which, I feel makes me feel like an old man, because you're reading the newspapers, which makes you feel old, and following the news and following what the politicians say, and it's like inflation has nothing to do with the government or the Reserve Bank. It's all something to do with something else.
Yep.
Do you feel that's been like I mean, you can understand it, right? No politician wants to put their hand up and say, oh, we caused this.
No, that's right. Exactly true. And I think the government is dodging responsibility for it as fast as they can.
And, of course, if you dodge responsibility for it, you don't come up with the right solution.
That's right. Yep.
The amazing thing, I just got to share this. I mean, I'm staggered in the world that we live in, Don. I just look at it and I don't know. I feel as either I'm wrong or the world's wrong. It can't be both. But it can't, But this thing where we going to fight inflation by removing the tax on petrol.
Yeah.
That doesn't do it, does it?
No, it's simply a window dressing thing. And indeed, in some sense, it makes matters worse because it increases the government's own deficit, which means it's spending more than it's taking in tax revenue, and that actually contributes to the problem.
Yes, indeed. And then the same thing is if you say, oh, I know what, we will compensate you for inflation by increasing government payments through various sources. And again,
yep.
That just adds to inflation rather than fix it.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I can understand why governments try to do that sort of stuff to avoid accepting responsibility, but as you say, it doesn't actually fix the problem. I mean, the main issue is the Reserve Bank's monetary policy. Now, they can't fix things absolutely by themselves. They need a support of government. I think Adrian Orr refers to the fact that monetary policy needs mates. It's much more difficult to control inflation if the government's running a big spending deficit. But essentially, the challenge is one for the Reserve Bank to deal with.
Now, of course, the other funny thing about petrol, just as an aside, is we're taxing it to fight climate change, and essentially subsidising it to fight inflation. So the net effect is net, but no one in the media seems to figure that out, or it's just sort of glossed over. The amount of analysis that's occurring in all of this is next to zero. Now, tell me this: what was the inflation rate when you became governor?
I'm having difficulty remembering it, and it was complicated by the fact that we'd had GST introduced in 1987, 10%, and then, of course, increased from 10% to 12.5% in that late 80 period. So if you take out the GST change, it was coming down even prior to my becoming governor.
Okay.
I mean, when the Labor government became government in 84, it said to the Reserve Bank, get inflation under control. They didn't specify at that point a particular target, but that was the instruction. So it was actually coming down before I became governor. It looked as if it was not coming down so much because of the GST impact, but it was beginning to come down even before I became governor.
So what was it, double digits?
No. This is really hard. I'm having difficulty remembering.
No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't
matter. People talk about the current figure. People talk about the current rate being the highest in 32 years. I think, from memory, it was probably about 5 or 6%. And we had to get it down below 2% by 1992. That was the target.
So you're given a target. And by the way, what happened if you didn't achieve your target?
Well, in principle, I got fired. I mean, it was quite clear in the Act that I was responsible personally for the inflation rate. Now, that's been changed, of course. It's currently responsibility of the Monetary Policy Committee as a whole. But until that changed just a couple of years ago, the governor was personally responsible for the inflation rate. And when a couple of times the inflation rate dipped above the target, the non-executive directors of the Reserve Bank wrote to the Minister of Finance and said, look, on reflection, we don't think this guy should lose his job because there was X, Y, and Z factors which were really sort of outside his control. Like, for example, the first Gulf War pushed up the price of oil, pushed the inflation rate above the target, and the director said, yep, that's a legitimate excuse for being outside the target.
Okay, so we had this high inflation, and it was coming down when you became governor. What had caused that high inflation back then? Well, pretty clearly, I think the tendency for having very loose monetary policy, and the inflation rate was blamed entirely on international oil prices. I recall in 81, when, as you mentioned, I was a National Party candidate, the Prime Minister, Rob Muldoon at the time, was blaming all the inflation rate in New Zealand essentially on international oil prices. And those prices did have an effect, without question. But the very loose monetary policy, very strong stimulatory fiscal policy were the major factors. Okay, you're going to have to explain this for me. What does loose monetary policy mean? How's it implemented? And what is strong fiscal policy? What are those things?
Rodney, you're very, very gracious. I know that you're a very competent economist yourself. Well, it basically, in fiscal policy, it means the government is spending more than it's taking in tax revenue. So it's pumping additional spending into the economy.
So it's
on the monetary policy side.
So just on that, so let's say in everyday terms, it's spending $110 and only taxing $100, and so there's a $10 gap. And how's it getting that $10?
Well, it's borrowing from the market.
Okay.
And that pushes up the total monetary base.
So I don't get that, you see. I'm being serious here, Don. I'm not that great an economist. So the government borrows $10. Who does it borrow it off?
Well, in the case of New Zealand, we borrow an awful lot offshore. We issue New Zealand dollar bonds, and many of those bonds are bought by international institutions, insurance companies, and so on. And we, in fact, have quite a significant proportion of our total New Zealand dollar government debt held offshore. It's international debt, though denominated in New Zealand dollars.
And so that
it adds to total demand.
Okay, so we've got, and of course, the government has pumped that $10 into the economy. It's not reflected in $10 worth of production because no one's paid for it, and so there's more dollars running around the New Zealand economy, adding to inflation because you've diminished the value of the New Zealand dollar against the goods and services being produced.
And adding to the balance of payments deficit.
Okay.
Because, as you point out, the total spending is greater than the production, and that's met by importing more than we're exporting.
Okay. Now, that's what's called strong fiscal policy or fiscal policy that's running a deficit. Now, what is, you said, and also what was happening was loose monetary policy. What's that?
Basically, keeping interest rates at a level which is well below the market rate, and institutions were obliged to buy government debt locally. Money was being created by the Reserve Bank in a way which was inflationary. And in fact, in 1981, which was the election year I referred to earlier, the Reserve Bank specifically warned the Prime Minister of the day, who of course was also Minister of Finance, that troubles were building up. There would be inflationary pressure building up. He refused to do anything about it. And of course, the following year, he imposed a very tight price and incomes control to try and get on top of that. But he was warned in 81 that this was a problem which was building up.
Okay, so loose monetary policy is the Reserve Bank doing what? It's creating money. It's lending money to the government.
Yeah,
what is it doing?
And keeping interest rates below what people want to save at. I mean, good example was the savings banks. Auckland savings banks and other savings banks were obliged by law to invest a lot of their deposits into government bonds, which were yielding very low interest rates.
Got it.
They didn't choose to do that because the rates were below the inflation rate, but they were forced to do that. And saving was a very unattractive option in that situation.
And there's got to be then a big distinction between real interest rates and the rates that you're seeing.
Yeah, that's right.
So the real interest rate...
In the early 80s...
Yeah.
The early 80s, the actual interest rates paid were well below the inflation rate, so the real interest rates were actually negative.
So I'm being punished for saving money.
That's right, yeah.
So I save $100. It's always going to have denominated on it $100, and I think it's $100. And then I'm getting, just let's make it simple, I'm getting 5% interest, and so in a year's time I have $105, and I think, whoa, I've earned $5, and on it goes, compounding up, and that's going to be my retirement savings. But the government of the day is borrowing money. Monetary policy is creating money or creating credit, and inflation's running at 10%. So while I have $155 at the end of a year, it'll only actually buy maybe $95 worth of goods and services.
And it's worse because you're paying tax on that $5.
Oh, wow. So the government sort of is robbing me.
Absolutely.
So inflation robs savers, and so presumably it benefits people who borrow up to the hilt and buy real assets.
Yep, absolutely. I've often quoted the story of my uncle who was an orchardist in Nelson all his life, sold his orchard in 1971, invested the proceeds of that into 18-year government bonds. I think the rate of interest was 5.4%. When those bonds matured in 1989, he was dead, fortunately, because the $30,000 for which he sold his orchard would have bought him one Toyota Corolla car and a small amount of change. In 1971, it would have bought him 11 Toyota Corolla cars. So he was robbed blind by doing what he thought was a prudent thing to do, investing in government stock.
Wow. Just get my head around that. He retires, he sells his farm, he's got the amount of money that would allow him to buy 11 cars, brand new. He invests his money wisely because he puts it with the government because he wants it to be safe because he's about to retire. And 18 years later, it's worth one car. Unbelievable, isn't it? It is unbelievable to think that. And of course, we're getting to it now. This is precisely what is happening at the moment.
That's right. And the borrowers, and by sheer chance, I came back to New Zealand in 1971, bought a house on the North Shore of Auckland for $43,000. It was a fabulous 5-bedroom house with a sea view.
You wouldn't even rent one for 6 months now for that.
That's right. By 1989, when my uncle's bonds matured, the house was probably worth $1.5 million. So I was benefited enormously, and he was at his expense effectively.
And of course, you had a mortgage that was eroded.
That's right. Exactly.
And of course, I grew up in an era when you just got the biggest mortgage you could get, bought the house, and
waited.
And time took care of it. And you thought, time, it's crazy, right? What did you do? You were tasked with the job of, and it'd be hard for listeners that weren't politically aware at this time to appreciate how controversial your job was. Because what did you do and what were the consequences of getting inflation down to this 2%?
Yeah, I mean, we pushed up interest rates to a high level to make saving attractive and spending less attractive. And it pricked a commercial property bubble, which of course followed the share market collapse in 87. And sadly, unemployment rose strongly. In 1991, unemployment reached 11%. And that was the consequence of having to squeeze inflationary pressures out of the economy.
And when you say you drove up interest rates, how did you do that?
I'm not sure that you actually want to understand this on this program, because we had a most unusual way of affecting interest rates, quite unusual by international standards. We had what was called a target amount of cash in the system, and the smaller that target was, the greater the likelihood that the banks were going to have to borrow from the central bank, and they didn't want to do that. So raising and lowering that amount of cash in the system, the amount of cash shared between all the settlement accounts of the banks with the central bank, affected interest rates generally. In fact, it was so effective that normally we didn't have to actually change the amount, we just had to look as we might.
Wow.
We have most central banks talk about OMOs, which is open market operations. We use the expression open mouth operations. When we wanted to tighten policy, I would clear my throat, and almost instantly rates would go up. It was almost the ultimate no hand central banking. But
it must have been rather exciting waking up in the morning and thinking I could go on Morning Report and clear my throat and drive up interest rates. Or what was the opposite of clearing your throat?
Well, it was. I mean, but both. The market understood the model the Reserve Bank was using, so they could interpret what was happening to the exchange rate and interest rates clearly, so that we had published our model. It was understood by the market, so we didn't have to explain very much most of the time. The market understood that things were getting too tight, or conversely getting too loose. And normally throat clearing worked in both directions.
And of course, politically, everyone focuses on unemployment, but there was another thing happening, and that is all asset prices affected on an expectation of interest rates and inflation rates. So you buy a farm,
that's right,
or you buy a factory, or you buy a piece of land, or you buy a house, and you're looking out 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Your mortgage might be running 30 years. And in order to do that, you have to make a judgment, or someone has to, about what the interest rates are going to be and what the inflation rate's going to be. And people typically up until this time just, this is what it is, and this is what it's been for the last couple of years, so this will be what it's like for the next 30 years. As soon as the interest rate shot up, all asset prices changed.
Yep, that's right.
And
right.
What were the consequences of that?
We had, as you well recall, a very sharp fall in share prices and in commercial property prices as a consequence of the high interest rates.
And who ultimately, wore the pain? So it'd be people with a mortgage, people who lost their job. All of that happened, right?
Yep, that's right. And that's why, in a sense, I spent a lot of time trying to explain to the public, Rotary clubs, farmers groups, etc., that I was deadly serious about getting inflation down, because the theory was, and practice was, as fast as people could adjust to a lower inflation rate, the faster interest rates would come down.
Yes. It is literally like taking horrible medicine, isn't it? You actually have to swallow the whole bottle, and if you try and take a teaspoon a day, all you do is extend the pain and make it worse.
I think that's right. Good analogy.
Well, and of course, the other terrible aspect of it politically is it's the person or government or people who are cleaning up the mess that are actually seen to be the cause of the pain.
That's right.
When in actual fact, it's everything that's gone before it.
That's right.
So let's
absolutely right, Rodney.
Let's bring this to present day, and I thank you, because this is just none of this is being explained at the moment, and there's no interest in a government or indeed the opposition to explain what has gone on here. There appears to be no ability in the media to analyse what is happening, and the rest of us are trying to make our way as best we can, very uncertain about what the future holds. But let's just talk about how we've got into where we are now, including legislative changes, I guess, and policy changes, and the difficulties such as COVID and the lockdowns that this government is confronted, and how it's dealt with it. Why are we now got the inflation back to, what, is it as high or higher than it was when you became governor and we had to go through that pain?
It's much the same, in fact. But break down the figure. The total figure, years of 12 months to the end of June, 7.3. That's made up of two basic components. An international component, which is oil prices and so on, that's over 8% over the last 12 months. But the significant figure which will worry the Reserve Bank is not the 8% figure, which is largely beyond their control, but the proportion of the 7.3, which is domestic inflation. And that was, I think, 6.3% in the year to the end of June. Now, that 6.3% is generated domestically and is a product of too much stimulus from the government and too much stimulus from the Reserve Bank. Now, when the pandemic was at its height, stimulus was entirely appropriate. We thought we were going into a very, very deep recession, potentially depression, understandably, both fiscal and both the government and the Reserve Bank stimulated the economy like crazy. They have not been fast enough to withdraw that stimulus.
So the government, when we had the lockdowns, the government spent a lot of money keeping businesses afloat. The government borrowed the money from the Reserve Bank. And I recall a figure that it was like 750 million or something a week.
I can't recall the number, but it was certainly very substantial spending beyond what the government was taking in the tax revenue. So there's deficit spending by the government and very low interest rates by the Reserve Bank.
And one of the amazing things about human nature is that you just operate on the day. You don't think a year ahead or 2 years ahead or look 1 year back or 20 years back or 20 years ahead. And it was staggering to me to watch this entirely artificial stimulus where production had been severely compromised. The Reserve Bank was, lending money to the government hand over fist, and the government was spraying money out hand over fist. And it was being written up as an economic miracle because not only had we defeated COVID, we had achieved it without too much economic distress. And it seemed to me at the time, and I wasn't particularly confident in my predictions because, you never are, but it seemed to me at the time that we were putting off the COVID thing, but more particularly, we were making a huge rod for our own back because the one thing we know, Don, is that politicians love spending money, find it very, very hard to save money, and so they weren't going to get off that drug easily. And that's exactly what happened.
That's right.
And then we knew...
That's true, and now we're paying the price.
And then we knew the consequence of that would be high inflation. And here it is, right? And now it's going to become a daily story of, I can't afford to eat, and I go to the supermarket, and it costs me this much to fill my car, and all the rest of it. And the analysis is, well, we're a poor country, and we are getting a poor country because we're not producing like we should be. So we're a poor country. But the diagnosis is wrong, and more particularly, at some stage, someone has to grapple with this inflation expectation that's occurred now.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the word expectation because expectations are quite an important part of the issue. If people expect inflation to be high, they behave as if inflation will be high, and lo and behold, prices go up. I mean, people rush out and buy now rather than waiting for the next month or months after because they expect prices to be higher down the track, and it becomes self-perpetuating. In fact, way back in time, I was on a TV panel judging suggestions from viewers about how to control inflation. And there were various suggestions. The one that got second, I think should have won, was someone who said inflation is caused to a significant extent by people expecting prices to go up. Because they expect prices to go up, they rush out and buy quickly and don't save anything because prices will be higher tomorrow than they are today. He said what we have to do is to create the expectation that prices will be falling. People will stop buying because next month prices will be lower. Lo and behold, prices fall. And while it was a bit simplistic, there's an element of truth in it.
Well, we have an expectation. We have an expectation building, and then you go across to the politics, and you're thinking there's absolutely no incentive for this government or the next government to grab, is this saying, grab the nettle by the hand or whatever it is to grab the nettle and actually deal with it because saying, we've got an election coming up, let's just stagger through this year and get beyond the election, and it's either a problem that we have to look at or someone else's problem, but it's never a good time politically to actually deal to the inflation beast.
But that's where the inflation targeting regime becomes relevant. I mean, it may be inconvenient for the government, for the Reserve Bank to keep tightening monetary policy, but that is what they have to do.
By law.
They have a target of 1% to 3% by law. It's written into their contract, They have to deliver it. And whatever the politics of the Monetary Policy Committee or the governor are, they have this commitment in writing to deliver inflation between 1 and 3. So there's going to be more tightening of policy, without a shadow of a doubt, in order to get an inflation rate pointing down again.
But that only works, presumably, if it's enforced.
Well, I mean, you mean if the government holds the Reserve Bank to account?
Yes.
You mean? Yes, I suppose that's right. But the Reserve Bank has a written contract to deliver inflation between 1 and 3 in the medium term. Now, if the medium term is a bit woolly, they can presumably fudge it a bit. But there's a limit to how much you can fudge it.
This is one of the wonderful differences between you and I, Don, because you have this wonderful faith in people, which I greatly admire. It made you a wonderful Reserve Bank governor, but a disastrous politician, because you sort of thought everyone would do the right thing and be good and proper and be total gentlemen. And I myself have a rather cynical view of politicians and Reserve Bank governors and whatnot. And I'm sitting there thinking, Grant Robinson, Jacinda Ardern, they're not going to worry about Adrian Orr. They're not going to sack him and say, oh, we need to bring back Don Brash and drive interest rates up and force farmers off their land and businesses to shut and unemployment to spike. They're going to say, no. Do not worry, Mr. Orr. Your job is safe with us, aren't they?
I agree that's a risk. But personally, even a governor who, let's supposing he supports the current government. I don't know whether it's politics now or not. Let's supposing he supports the current government. He's got a reputation of his own on the line. Is he going to fail in the task he's been given and which has been given to him in writing?
Yeah,
that's a significant challenge.
Yeah,
right?
I guess. Yeah. Well, some people care about their good name and some people just want to stay in power. Tell me this. It seems to me with inflation that you always have, and I think this is a danger that, again, isn't appreciated. They're thinking, oh, well, it's 7% or it could be 9%. But historically and around the world, we have seen inflation take off where there's almost no end to it. Because once it starts building, it starts accelerating. Is that correct?
That's certainly a very high risk, I agree. And central banks around the world are very acutely aware of that risk. And as you've seen, the Bank of Canada the other day, for example, raised their interest rates by 1 full percentage point. That was the biggest increase by any central bank, I think, in the last little while. But it indicates they're very determined to get the thing under control. And I think that'll be true of all the major central banks. And might that trigger a recession? Absolutely, it might. I think there's a high risk of that at this point.
Yes, because if the Reserve Bank governor does their job and gets inflation under control, then interest rates are going to go up and economic activity takes a dive.
Yep, that's right.
But if you don't do that, inflation goes up at a potentially accelerating rate, your economy still takes a dive and you've got inflation.
That's right.
And at the end of the day...
No easy answers.
At the end of the day, the medicine, one way or the other, has to be delivered because I've got a very simple economic view. In order to eat something, you first have to produce it. And there's no... I mean, it almost seems, Don, that we want to have a magic theory of government and monetary policy, don't we?
That's right.
And that,
social for a magic solution.
Social credit. And I was amazed because, we had social credit and you could just lend money for zero interest and all the rest of it. And it's very, you're only borrowing the money off yourself sort of thing, and it's all grand. And you think, and those dirty bankers don't get to take all that interest off you. But this thing called someone sent me a couple of some years ago, and they said, what do you make of this? And they sent me this long treatise on this new monetary theory, which has sort of captured all the stupid stuff seems to come out of universities, and this new monetary theory had come along, and I was reading this stuff by these famous academics, supposedly, scribbling away, and it struck me that it was sort of like social credit reinvented.
Yep, very similar, Rodney.
And then the other thing that I would observe, Don, is that you never want to give politicians an excuse to spend money ever, because they will. And I mean, we've seen that. And I mean, everyone was thinking that Jacinda Ardern and this government, just like they did with Muldoon, remember he was the economic magician or the wizard, because he could keep us afloat when everyone else was suffering. And any politician can do that. They can do that for a good few years, even if they inherit a good set of books. But man, oh man, does it catch up with them? And it may not be them that actually have to deal with it. It wasn't Sir Robert Muldoon that had to front up to the crisis that his policies, which he did to get re-elected, had to deal with. It was the fourth Labor government and poor Don Brash, who was pushed out and sent off to the Rotary Club in Westport on a cold and rainy night to explain why those people were out of work, and the farmers were losing their farms. Right?
Yep.
You must have done that a bit.
Right.
You must have done that a bit.
I did a lot of that. Yep. A lot of it.
Do you find?
In fact, I think that's one of the responsibilities of the government.
Well, you were famous for it. You were very, very famous for it, Don. This was long before I was in politics, and I knew of you because you were travelling the country explaining this and fronting up when no one else was particularly keen to, and the opposition were all over you. I remember Mr. Peters in particular being all over you because everything was your fault.
That's true of Mr. Peters. But intriguingly, when the Reserve Bank legislation was passed in 1989, there wasn't a single dissenting vote in Parliament. It was a Labor government bill. National supported it. To be fair, Muldoon was in hospital. I think if Muldoon had been in the House, he might have opposed it, but he was in hospital.
But as soon
Every
as
single person in the House,
as soon as it got tough, right, you were political fodder.
Yes, that's true. And in the Bolger government, I was saved, I suspect, by the then Minister of Finance, Ruth Richardson.
Indeed. Now, we did achieve 0 to 2% inflation.
Yeah, we did.
So it sort of proves the theory, doesn't it? It proves that inflation can be brought under control.
Yep.
It proves that inflation is the responsibility of the Reserve Bank in tandem with government, with its fiscal policy.
Yep, that's right.
And that if you lose control of inflation, it's political, it's caused internally by the government of the day, and it has to be the government of the day, whoever it is, to fix it.
That's right, with the central bank.
Does it break your heart to see what's happening?
It's certainly depressing, Rodney, no question at all. But at the moment, at least, I'm working on the assumption that the Reserve Bank will bring inflation down to a target within the next year or 18 months. Now, you may be right. It may be that they won't. But at this point, at least, I still have a degree of faith in them.
Okay, and if they do that, that'll see interest. I mean, we know we're not giving financial advice, and this is all predicated on a whole lot of political actors. But would that mean, given that you don't have the information that the Reserve Bank governor, all those caveats, the expectation is that you tighten monetary policy and you tighten fiscal policy?
Yep.
And if you tighten monetary policy, that means interest rates go up.
Yep.
And if you tighten fiscal policy, that means easy spending days are over.
That's right.
Could you tighten fiscal policy by holding spending where it is now, or would you need to decrease it?
Well, at the moment, the government is spending quite a lot more than they're taking in tax revenue. So they either have to increase taxes or reduce spending to reduce that deficit. It's the size of the deficit which is providing additional stimulus. And that's what has to be cut back. And that's why it's politically hard to do.
And, of course, you don't want to head into an election having put taxes up. You don't want to head into an election having cut government services or payments. And you don't want to head into an election with interest rates going up.
Yep.
And, of course, the other interesting thing is...
Among other things...
Sorry?
I was going to say, among other things, because interest rates going up is going to further depress the housing market,
yes,
which won't win a lot of votes for the current government either.
No, and then, of course, you have this interesting thing where if the government keeps its spending up, keeps running a deficit, then the Government Reserve Bank is in a real quandary because they can't do it on their own.
Yep.
They can keep yanking up interest rates, but, of course, they're going to go higher than they ever would otherwise.
That's right.
Oh, dearie me.
And to be fair, I mean, the governor's made that quite explicit. He did an interview with the IMF not long ago,
yes,
saying monetary policy needs mates.
Yes.
And he was saying to Grant Robertson, effectively, I need some restraint by you, Minister, if you're to avoid monetary policy having to be tightened in a very drastic way.
So imagine this, Don. I don't know. At the next election, we get a decent government. I can't see one in prospect, to be honest, even with the opposition. But let's just fantasise. We get a decent government. That is to say, they want to actually deal with problems rather than just keep kicking a can down the road. And the call goes out, who do we know that can fight inflation? Well, there was that guy, right? Would you be up for it, Don?
There are other people, Rodney, who do the job very effectively. And the person I would probably nominate is someone like Arthur Grimes.
Yes, indeed.
First-class guy. Yeah.
So there's not a shortage of personnel?
No.
Well, the only thing I say... Look, I know that you have got... great ability and great insight. But the great thing about even getting your name associated with the policy is the one thing that we learned in the early 90s about Don Brash is he was real and he wasn't about to buckle. And you will know this. Everyone was looking at he's going to buckle, he's going to buckle, he's going to buckle. And to the extent that they thought that the Reserve Bank governor would buckle, much like I'm saying is going to happen now, that just delayed and deepened the problem. We actually had to believe that Don Brash, the man, wasn't going to buckle, and that was what gave you confidence that inflation would be under control. That's what reversed expectations downwards, and that's what actually got us through the problem, the fact that, you wouldn't buckle. And it just occurs to me, Don, I'm not trying to downplay your knowledge and skill set, but your name associated with does send a big sign out to the marketplace, this man ain't going to buckle. You put in Arthur Grimes.
You could have put Rodney Hide.
Sorry?
Or Rodney Hyde.
Oh, no, I'd be a complete posse. I'd be a complete pussy. I just want to be loved. I'd say, yeah, whatever. No. Look, you were very, very tough. You were extraordinary. Man, that you took a tough time. But, you're bringing someone who's eminently reasonable, like Arthur Grimes, and everyone's going to be looking at them saying, oh, well, I know he's a good economist, I know he knows his stuff, but has he got the backbone? And that's going to take a while to bed in. And the Minister of Finance, have they got the backbone? Because what I'm suggesting to you at the moment, that's what we're lacking. You look at it and you think, oh, no, they're not going to stick at this because, we haven't got those tough decision makers. We don't have a Roger Douglas and a Ruth Richardson and a Don Brash at the moment.
Certainly don't. We we certainly don't have a register with riches, and that's absolutely true, sadly.
Okay, Don. Well, look, thank you for your service, and thank you for the time that you've had with us today. I wish that you could do more to explain inflation to everyone, because I think that's one of the problems that we have with it, the appalling lack of public and political understanding of the issue.
Thank you very much, friend. Thank you.
Take care. That was the great Reserve Bank Governor, Dr. Don Brash.